So, welcome to this interview at earth.org. I'm very happy today to be speaking with Peter McAteer, author of Leading the Sustainable Organization. And very happy to have you today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I enjoy, always enjoy these kind of conversations, and I'm looking forward to a chat.
I thought we'd start out by learning a little bit more about your own background, whether you're a leader of a sustainable organization yourself or you've been in contact with many of the others. So why don't you share with our readers, where did this come from?
Well, I've been doing various things for the better part of close to 50 years now. So my business journey has been long, and you could probably divide it in half. The first part of my career, let's say the 80s and 90s, was really about business transformation. And for people with a long memory, we can remember changes to the telecommunications industry and all sorts of other industries, which were changing. A lot of big monopolies were being broken up. Interstate banking was changing, et cetera. So I was doing a lot of that for global businesses. And my touch on issues of sustainability was more accidental. A lot of companies, even though they were invited to go to Earth Day and these different events, it wasn't a really big issue for a lot of people. But I often said, sure, I'll go. I'll attend the meeting and see how that goes. And it also was just every now and then you'd get a client who was an NGO or something else, and you'd get exposed to it. And then one day I got a call from a recruiter saying that the United Nations was looking for someone, and would I be interested in running learning and leadership development for them? And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. The company I was with was getting bought, so I said, it's a nice little transition. And I just happened to join as we were creating the Millennium Development Goals. And again, as I went through that, I just happened to raise my hand every now and then because people didn't quite know what to do with certain issues. So the Bureau of Development Policy was struggling to try to figure out things. And I said, fine, I'll take over the knowledge management activities. And we had just launched the year before I got there, the UN Global Compact. And again, trying to get that to fit was a little challenging at first. And I was one of the few people with private sector experience. So it just became one of those things I did. And then 4 or 5 years later, another recruiter called me and said, would you like to be managing director at Harvard Business Publishing? And I said, well, that sounds interesting. And again, it coincided with various changes, and people like Michael Porter were writing about shared value creation. And we were publishing books by a number of people who were talking about the need to sort of reinvent capitalism. So all of these things were beginning to happen. And I went on consulting after that, and that sort of coincided with the changeover to the Paris Accords in 2015. And with that, I just was asked many times to say, that someone wanted the slide deck. Can you give me this? Can you give me suggestions? And so I decided to write my first book, which was designed to sort of lay out a roadmap. Sustainability is the new advantage. And as the years progressed, the issue became more about, well, if you've gotten started, how do you accelerate change? And so I wrote Pathways to Action. And now, as we're now 10 years after Paris, and into a very, very different dynamic, I wrote Leading the Sustainable Organization, but the subheading is just as important. It's the quest for ethical brands and a culture of sustainable innovation. And I try to put the issue of ethics in there because I personally find it's very, very difficult to separate the issue of trying to do the right thing from all of this stuff that people get wrapped around with ESG reporting and all sorts of other things. And then we have the silliness where we have ESG investment indexes with 7 oil companies or something. You say, how is this? How did we get here? So all of this, to me, it felt like transition needs to happen at legacy companies because they are the ones who are producing their products and services. And so we've got to get to those people and offer them an opportunity to say, is there a different way to operate? And can you give me some detail about how to do that? It's easy to say, be different. But at the end of the day, these people are under pressure. So I've got to say, well, how do you remain profitable and start behaving in a different way that leads you to greater success? And so anyway, that's my history, and it's tied in with my own interest. But my interest really came to a head, 25 years ago when I joined the United Nations.
And it's interesting to see how long this history is now. As you mentioned, I mean, people have kind of forgotten about the existence of the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the SDGs. But getting from not having those to having them is already a huge step. And I think you mentioned this in the book as well. How this is not a new phenomenon. This is something people have been talking about for decades.
Well, I think what people often, without understanding history, people just lose some context. And so every now and then I'll get a call and someone says, can you come in and teach everybody the core legal things that we need to know about? And I said, well, sure, happy to. But we just need to sort of focus on what are you talking about? And then I say, well, there's 250 different international intergovernmental agreements in force since the 1970s. Would you like me to cover all 250? And they say, no, just the important ones. I said, well, they're all potentially important. I said, it depends. I said, but that complexity is part of the challenge. It's all very well-meaning. But again, there are different things. If you're interested in desertification, well, there are specific programs around that. If you're interested in toxic waste, if you're interested in fishing beyond the international limits of 200 miles, if you're interested in tax law, there's all sorts of different agreements, and we're seeing some of that play out now as conflict happens around the world. And some of the conflict is driven by things like water scarcity. Well, there's a whole bunch of agreements that deal with issues like water scarcity and how do you deal with that. And so there are rules, but we're now, this is part of what I call boundary conditions. And the idea is these variables were always there, but they seemed stable. So we didn't pay attention. And now as they're beginning to move around, everyone is acting like it's brand new stuff. And I had someone the other day say to me, what we really need is some organization that settles the science. And I said, you got it. That came up in 1987. And that's why we created the IPCC. That was the answer to that question. The issue is we don't need another group to settle the science. We just have to have some faith in that science is telling us the right story. Two different questions.
Every once in a while, while I was reading your book, there were certain things in there that were saying like, oh yes, this is what this is. This is where this came from. And I thought, well, but although it is extremely sophisticated and complicated, and you go through, from the beginning to end, sometimes the beginning part, I was picturing the sustainability-oriented leader, the leader it was like that Chris Pratt meme who's saying, I haven't asked about these, and now I'm afraid to ask. That's kind of what we need sometimes, is that if somebody has gotten to this point in their career and they still don't know what the Paris Agreement is, I think it's good to have that down on paper. It's good to answer the questions that you've mentioned. But it also leads me to my own question. Who do you think, who did you write this book for? Who's it aimed for? Or who's it aimed at?
All of my work is got two primary audiences in mind. So I focus on the idea where the world is attempting to meet certain goals by 2030. And so if you look at that, you say, well, who can influence 2030? Well, you have to be in business right now. You have to be in a leadership position. So the book is published by Anthem Press, which is primarily a company dealing in textbooks for students and things. So students need something which lays everything out in fairly good detail. And it's one of the reasons in the book I also put in a lot of the research references. I put in additional databases that you could look at and things like that. And every one of my books is cross-referenced in some way to allow you to go forth. So, but the people who are in school are the ones we want to solve the problems of the world by 2050. Right? Because they've got to get into their careers and do something. So I take the books, and when I do workshops, I use the book as a supplement, but then I change all the stories and the case studies and things for people who are in business today, because it becomes important to say, all right, who's in the room today? we're agriculture. Oh, okay, well then we'll do something different. We're small business over large business. We're intergovernmental. Ooh, so last year I was working with people in Romania. It's a very different market in Romania. I was dealing with people in Poland, very, very different. This fall, I'll be teaching at a university in Puerto Rico with small island people. They have very specific issues around in the Caribbean, around islands. So the key is you've got to reach people where they are. Now, the basic construct of the book of understanding boundary conditions is still relevant. It's just I modify that if you're a current leader, because I have to assume the fact that you might have 20, 30, 40 years of experience. And I don't want to throw that out. I want to say, how do we supplement what you know and give you just enough to say this is the direction, which is why in the book, I do believe in this idea of expanding things out, which gets a little confusing. But then you narrow it back and say, what am I really asking of you? And that's why there's a point in the book where I say, okay, so what I want you to do is find competitive advantage and sustainable innovation. And then I want you to do nothing negative, right? So don't do anything bad anymore. And then, I want you to behave ethically. And I want to say, are there some things we can fix on all this bad stuff we've done? And you can narrow it down to 4 or 5 things. And you say, at the end of the day, that's what I want you to do. And if you can just stick to that conceptually and say, how do I do the right thing consistent with those ideas? I think you're pretty much there. When it gets to doing your reporting and whether you're going to follow the GRI or whether you are submitting to science-based targets or participating in the Carbon Disclosures Project, or that's different. And you always have people around who can guide you on that. So I tell people that's really not the worry. Don't worry about the detail. We'll find someone who can write a pretty report.
This isn't for the wonks, so to speak, who can talk endlessly about GRI. Oh well, when GRI 4 came out, that was really now this isn't for them.
That's getting easier. It's getting much, much easier as things progress. 10 years ago, it was a big deal. 5 years ago, it was still a relevant deal. Today, I pretty much recommend, the software that does that. The big issue is how do you negotiate with your suppliers and figure out whether they're on board with your purpose in ways that you can work together. That's hard. And getting accurate data is still hard at scope 3. But scope 1, scope 2, there's lots of easy ways to do that. So I don't worry as much about that. There are training classes we can give people. You still go back down to the bottom line is, what's your product portfolio look like? And are these products ever going to become sustainable by design? Are they ever going to become net neutral? Or do we start having to redesign your whole product portfolio? And if so, how long is it going to take? How much money is it going to take? What kind of capabilities do we need? The reporting, we'll get to that next week. We'll nail that down. Don't worry about that.
You talk a lot about boundary conditions throughout the book, and you mentioned just now, and that yes, they have changed over time. We need to keep track, but I have to say that even looking at my own history in this area, this is a time of enormous chaos and uncertainty in those boundary conditions, that they're changing much more rapidly. Would you agree with that, or is this just another blip? That
no. Every now and then we go through a period of higher variability. And one of the things I mentioned in the book is simply the idea of knowledge maturity. So there are some things, and if I speak with a group, I might say, listen, if I get 5 CFOs in a room and I say, let's look at the balance sheet, everyone just picks up the paper and looks. I don't have to explain anything to anybody. They know exactly what I mean. If I go in and I take 5 human resource people and say, let's talk about high potential individuals, then they start saying, well, what do you mean by high potential? We don't like to use the word high potential. And you take 30 minutes to figure out what are we going to talk about. That's a lower maturity domain.
Yeah.
So within sustainability, there's lots of areas that are low maturity. And as such, it's going to take a while for those to evolve. And so it's useful to know which areas are pretty settled, which areas are evolving, and where do I have to spend my time, or who do I delegate this to, who can be my specialist in that area and make sure we're on target. So I think this really is a question of, where are we as a market around the world? And what do I have to pay attention to? And I would do a lot of work with smaller to mid-sized companies because I think they're quite interesting to work with, and a lot in Asia. And in Malaysia, for example, it doesn't really matter what you want as a company. The question is you're exporting. And if you're exporting to the US, to the European Union, or China, they drive the boat, right? What they want is what matters. So if you're trying to sell a textile in Bangladesh into Nike, I'm sorry, you have to understand what Nike's requirements are. And Nike is going to, depending on what you're doing, is going to adhere to the European standards, as well as the US Security and Exchange standards, as well as the Chinese standards. So they're going to say, here's our stuff, because they're trying not to get 10,000 vendors to all figure it out themselves. So there are things happening in markets like that where there's an easy answer. But if you're a big guy, and you're trying to replace, like, let's say you're a BASF and you're trying to replace $70 billion in revenue without making plastics that are bad for the environment, that's a really hard challenge. That's hard to do. And so how do you go on a transition and keep your job? Because your board is going to fire you if you just decide, oh, we've got 10 years to transition and we're not going to make any money for 10 years. It's not going to be a really popular kind of thing. So all of these challenges are, I like to look at them as unique, and you say, fine, I'm not here to make a judgment. How do we get you on a path that accelerates at a level that at least keeps us abreast of these international commitments and goals and the need to stay within these temperature changes and things like that? And that's I think, really where most companies are. If they have their head in the right place, that's really where they are.
You talk in many times in the book about the North Star, and I think it's one of the few phrases I actually wrote down the quote for as being as the need to create an aspirational and actionable North Star.
Yeah.
And I compared that. I mean, one of the companies I think has a decent one, my alma mater, BASF, that you just mentioned. But there's a lot of companies out there that have corporate purposes that are much better described as, vapid and vague. And I wonder what goes wrong in that process. Why do we have so many? We strive for a better tomorrow for our children and our future, for the beautiful. And now there's so much out there that, and I'm sorry to say, some of it is described as HBR language, but or even Michael Porter. But
it's hard for a large legacy company to make the kind of commitment, because once you make the commitment, now everyone is looking at you saying, well, why aren't you making faster progress? So, there's a lot of companies out there that, people look at a Patagonia and you say, well, Patagonia's always had a pretty clear purpose from the very beginning. They didn't really have to make a big transition. If you look at a Unilever, it also tends to be held up there as a company that's done good things. And I give them credit for the things they've done. But they've been on this journey now for 15 years, 18 years. It's not been a short thing, but they had the advantage of starting early when other people weren't. So the scrutiny of them wasn't as strong. Now you move forward today, if you're a late adopter, people are much less accepting of what you're doing. So I think the purpose conversation, if you're Johnson & Johnson and you have 300 divisions, that's interesting. That's an interesting challenge. It's like, okay, I got to get 300 divisions on the same page, as opposed to a smaller company. There's a new automotive company out in Michigan, Slate, which is making these little pickup trucks. They haven't made any yet. But for them to have a clear purpose is, okay, for a startup company, they're focused. They haven't even made a product yet. All they have is pictures of products and prototypes. It's easier to be clear. If you're Nestle and you're trying to create a circular agriculture business that no one has ever done successfully, This is a challenge. So again, I think this is something where there's risk involved. Companies have to be careful of how they frame it, about how they frame their progress, and it's not as easy as as people, excuse me, as people will sometimes say.
Mhm.
But again, I think it's a worthy exercise. It's a worthy exercise to walk through. You can get close, and again, you can evolve over time. You've had very big companies like the BNP Paribas, the big bank in Europe, which a lot of what they did in purpose was to talk about the things they weren't going to invest in. We're not going to invest in tobacco companies. We're not going to invest in fracking. We're not going to invest in the North Slope. We're not going to do this, not going to do this, not going to do this, not going to do this. Oh, okay. And so you create this thing, which is largely a bunch of stuff decided at a senior level because you're a bank, you're highly regulated. But then if you turn around and say, great, now you're a teller or you're a customer service representative, what are you
What does
doing
that
different? What does this mean? And it doesn't mean anything because
mean?
I didn't make fracking loans anyway. I just sit here at my teller and take people's money. So translating it is often really hard also. This sounds good, and the senior guys seem to know what they're doing, but what do I do differently tomorrow? And so one of the reasons I take some time in the book to talk about innovation and to talk about it's not enough to say we're going to do disruptive innovation or reverse engineering or whatever it is. I've got to work through the levels of management in the company and say, so what do you really get to do? Do you
Mhm.
get to issue a green bond? No, the CFO can do that. You're over here in supply chain. What can you really do? What are the boundaries? Again, the boundary conditions that constrain you. And within that, give me some ideas, what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not allowed to do. And if I can successfully do that, I unleash the innovation across the enterprise in service of the purpose. And now everyone is redefining it together. And sooner or later you say, okay, let's modify that one. And we'll change that a little bit. But it is a very important thing, and it is very strongly connected to the idea of ethics. Purpose and ethics are
You just you just
intertwined.
mentioned a minute ago the difference between a giant multinational, maybe a legacy company been around for 100 years, trying to move towards a more sustainable business model, and also in an environment where the rewards, the external rewards for stating and then following through on sustainability are also constantly changing. I mean, 2 years ago compared to now, how do we see things changing in the United States, for example, it's a major example of that. But the difference between one of those giant multinationals with multiple departments, 100 subdivisions, business units, versus a smaller company, maybe a startup who's purpose driven from the start. So I wanted you to talk through a little bit how leadership, sustainability oriented leadership would differ between these two types of companies.
Yeah. When you're in a small company, you generally have line of sight management. So you get to know everybody. You may very well be the founder. You may own a lot of founding stock. So the context is really quite different. And you are still, though, focused on the core idea of where do I find competitive advantage in sustainability. So your challenge is different in that very often you've got the right product. Again, I'll use that company I just mentioned, Slate. You've got the idea. We're trying to build this little pickup truck for $20,000 or something like that, that no one else in the United States can offer. And you say, okay, great. You still are going to need product 2 and product 3 and product 4 and product 5. So what your ability to go from N and N plus 1 to multiple iterations and to expand your supply chain and expand your markets are all sets of decisions. So one of the ways I try to do this in the book is I give different sort of graphic images of a way to think through it. So if you're a stock company, okay, there's a set of conditions associated with being publicly traded that you have to work through and align your purpose with. But maybe you're not publicly, okay, so we move on to something else. Your choices of customers and markets are choices. you may not have made those choices. So if you're a big legacy company, someone else probably made that choice about being in that market 10 years ago. And you just assume that's the right thing. So the question is, am I allowed to revisit that? As opposed to the startup where all the customers are new, all the markets are new. So, and everybody is bringing with them this background. And we're now trying to take my experience in company A and company Z and company M and trying to put it to work in service of this new idea. So small companies have a totally different set of challenges. You don't need all the process. You need clarity of purpose, and everybody has to be a bit of a generalist. So that's often even where your hiring strategy is different in that instance, because you're looking at people who might come from a large multinational company, but want the chance to get the roll up their sleeves. And because they have a broad base of experience, they can jump over here or over here or over here and help out. And they like that because they're interested in legacy. Conversely, you are in a big company and you're in supply chain and you've got a much more narrow set of things to do, but you've got great reach. Again, the challenges there are very, very different. So, and again, the people you want there, I don't know if I tell the story in this book, but I've told it before. I'd worked with the supply chain people at Mahindra and Mahindra, the big tractor company based in India. And Anand Mahindra, which it always helps when your name is on the company, announced that they were not going to use single-use packaging anymore from their suppliers, which sounded fantastic. And made this announcement at a big environmental conference. Well, the people in supply chain had never heard that. And some of these people had been working in this business for 30 years and had no clue what to do. Well, what am I supposed to do? I have 10,000 suppliers. Every one of them now has to take back their packaging. Is that what we mean? Or we have to standardize the packaging? And when I take the parts out, I have to store the packaging? Where the hell do I store all this stuff now? And it just opens up a zillion questions that they were not prepared to answer. It's got nothing to do with whether I like the idea or don't like the idea. It's just like, this is a lot bigger than you think. And we really have to spend some time doing this. And then you start getting into very specific questions like, so am I going to lend money to the supplier who I like and I've worked with for 10 years to help them? Or am I going to toss them aside and pick someone else? And those become more ethical questions of what's the right thing to do here? Is to work with people and bring them along, to toss them aside and look for others. Do relationships matter? And you start getting in, again, I think, into very human, very interesting questions about organizational behavior and how does that fit with this purpose? And what does purpose really mean? And that's the idea of translating it down, although I used the example before of tellers and customer service representatives. In this instance, massive company, hundreds of thousands of parts and people, and I'm in supply chain. I'm narrowly defined functionally, but what does that purpose mean to me in terms of my obligations to these people I've worked with for 10 years? Okay, let's see if we can turn that into action.
So is it Anand Mahindra, is he the sustainability oriented leader that you would recommend as a role model, or is there someone else that you've met? Or
I think role models are tough. I think there's, again, in a time of big change, right? It's easy to find interesting people. You know, there's a little what do they do? Seabound, a UK startup that does emissions tracking for ships. And there's a woman there, I believe it's Alicia Fredrickson. Again, very interesting little company, and that's fascinating. Now, is that person a role model? I don't know. I mean, possibly. Is Yves Chouinard, the longtime chairman of Patagonia? Well, he's a pretty good one, but I don't know if you can adapt what he's doing necessarily. You know, company. It really does help if you own all the stock in the company. It's the same thing with Elon Musk. I mean, it's leaving the politics aside. You say, well, he's built some really interesting things. Would I hold him up as a role model? I think that's a different sort of question. And so I think there's lots of things. So I think what you find is someone in BASF, which you mentioned, came up with the idea of chem cycling, came up with the idea of mass balance. These are really interesting ideas. These are really good innovations. Now, how they get adapted, to be honest, tends to happen over multiple people, over multiple time. So the real task for the organization is not just that I have a person, such as Yves Chouinard, but now what happens as he's retired? Do we have a real talent development process here? And that's, again, one of the reasons I go through, and it may not be this book, but it may have been one of the previous ones, where as you're looking at a person, you say, well, that's the first thing, to develop one leader. Now the question is, can I build other leaders? And that's all sort of internally focused. Then I want to say, well, how about externally focused towards my customers, towards my investors, towards my suppliers? Am I recognized for having that kind of leadership and that kind of culture? So there's different levels of this as you grow it as a business, but it all does start with one committed leader. But I don't think that just means CEOs. I think somewhere along the line, you had to have in supply chain someone who really grabbed this and said, this is the right thing to do. We're really doing something good here for our communities, for the environment. How do we tackle this? How do I embrace this? I worked with some of the big casinos in Macau. Now, you generally wouldn't think, okay, casino, is this a role model I want everyone to emulate? But they did some wonderful things with donating property surrounding them to McAteer's small businesses, where they offered them below market rents to preserve the culture of what had been Macau. Now, again, he said, well, that's actually a really nice thing to do because that property is worth a lot of money. Would I hold that up? Hard to say that I would say the head of the casino is the role model for sustainability. And I'm not saying they're not nice people, but I think in this kind of maturing market, there are many models. There are many models.
But it's also, of course, how material that is to the business. I remember being very impressed with the work that some of the Macau casinos were doing in recycling their used playing cards, which, by the way, the number of playing cards that a casino goes through boggles the mind. But in a certain sense, yes, that's core to the business. But on the other hand, is the gaming industry even a sustainable? Can it be considered a sustainable or an ethical industry? Is an entirely different question.
Well, there's a good example of someone that most people know, like a Jensen Huang at NVIDIA. Very popular company, huge stock market gainer. And one of the things that gets a little less attention is these new NVIDIA chips. What they've also done is redesign all the cabling in the racks. And in many ways, what they're doing is they're using about 50% less power for the same amount, for the equivalent amount of computing. Now, the computing power has expanded rapidly, but because artificial intelligence is consuming so much energy, innovations in the data center are really important because you're not going to get rid of artificial intelligence. It's coming, it's going to happen, and there's going to be massive amounts of investment in data centers. So having a focus that says, I'm not only improving the chip, but I'm improving the reliability, I'm reducing the amount of heat being created, I'm reducing the amount of energy being created. And by the way, I've saved you $2 million on cabling. So the cost to you is less, and we can get rid of all the old stuff. It doesn't translate well to a sustainability report. But you say that set of design choices by itself is terribly important in an area, because otherwise Microsoft and all these other companies who are very well-meaning, they've got nice sustainability models and designs and commitments. But Microsoft last year was up 29% in emissions, all due to data centers, right? So you can say, I'm really committed, but this product is going crazy here.
What you just mentioned, whether or not it translates into a sustainability report, I mean, that's an interesting question in itself. This is something else I wanted to ask you about, is telling your story.
Yep.
Yes, if Microsoft is up 29% because of their data center power consumption, but some other company, NVIDIA, has managed to hold back, stem the tide, or hold back the flood because they've got a cabling innovation. It's absolutely something that I'd like to read about in a sustainability report. But on the other hand, we have many companies who are doing the most extreme level of outright blatant greenwashing that we've seen to date. One of the previous authors, whose book I reviewed here, authored a book about greenwashing, and I have to say I knew it was happening, but the level and the shamelessness was extraordinary. And I wonder what's your thought on that? How does an ethical leader, especially you mentioned the other word, brand, someone who wants to lead an ethical brand?
Well, there is a chapter in the book on the idea of how to avoid derailment. And this is not new. The issue of greenwashing and things is relatively new with sustainability and climate action. But the idea of companies not having sufficient controls so that fraud happens or these other things, this has been with us for a while. So part of the challenge here as a senior leader, the senior team, has to construct a set of controls that are sufficient to have reviews. And so one of this is, again, in a low maturity knowledge domain, we know psychologically that people are very bad at identifying their own biases, right? We're terrible at it. That's just a human condition, right? And so someone who's been doing marketing one way for 30 years, and if you're left to do your own thing, can get you into trouble. And I won't even say it's because they're doing it for ill reasons. It's just that they're used to telling a story and they got ahead of themselves. And but you have to be able to say, well, what's the answer to that? Well, part of the answer is collectively, we're actually very good at seeing each other's biases. But it requires you to have a group decision-making process, which is part of the controls, that says, if you're going to introduce a new product, as an example, we're going to introduce a checklist. And there are a variety of companies who have done this. And so we've got to be able to ask a series of questions, and you must be able to answer them in the positive in order for us to release this in that way. And that's just a control. It just says, I'm going to ask you to force this sort of thinking into the product design group or into the marketing group. And I'm going to ask you to do the check with the CFO or the other person, just to make sure we're in good shape. Because along the way, we do have to consider the fact that from a risk basis, this is now getting more expensive. And that is the logic, because you can walk into a company now and I can say to them, well, yes, but Deutsche Bank got fined X millions of dollars for doing this, and the CEO lost their job. And in Canada, they're very, very hard on this. Australia, they're very tough on this. Europe is a real leader in this. The US less so, China less so. But it is where good regulation works hand in hand. And I don't mean layers of regulation, but positive public policy levels the playing field, creates clarity, and I think that really helps people from ruining their career. But you do have to have a set of controls with purpose in mind. That you have to start with the purpose and start with having people with a good ethical framework. And then you have to say, what can we say that's legitimate, consistent with both the intent and the letter of the law? And generally speaking, you don't get yourself in trouble when you follow those sort of rules. And if you do, you get a slap on the hand of, okay, that was stupid, but not, the death knell to the company.
Well, you say early in the book that you go through a list of regulatory frameworks, but then you mentioned that there are many areas that are still left unregulated.
Correct.
And this is something that we will probably see more of. And the topic of regulating sustainability has come up a lot. I mean, of course, there's the saying that if we're talking about ethics, then if it were black and white, then it would be called legislation, it would be called regulation. It wouldn't be called ethics. And so ethics is a kind of a gray area, or it covers the gray areas. But on the other hand, I've also seen quite a few views that sustainability is becoming compliant. There's someone I know who joined joined a BSR in the United States about a year ago, said she was shocked that all of her clients reported to all of her clients reported to compliance, reported to the chief legal officer. So what do you think about that? Do you think a solid regulatory background or legal background is now a must for the sustainability-oriented leader?
No, well, I think I would make a distinction between people who sit in a separate sustainability function and someone who is a sustainable leader. So I chart out in the book a 4-stage model. 1 that starts with compliance, 2 that starts with experimentation, 3 that leads on to acting with purpose, and level 4 being where you are acting strategically, and that is sustainable by design. So there's a lot happening with the harmonization. We've had a focus on harmonization for 5 years now, since I forget which COP meeting it was, but we really said we need to get all these things closer together. We are getting there. A lot of the US regulatory change that did not happen 2 years ago with the SEC regulations, I look as a step sideways. I don't see it as a step back, because the twin issues of biodiversity and climate change are not going away. It's got nothing to do with politics. So if you're a bank, if you're an insurance company, and you are looking at the Florida real estate market, I don't care what the governor says or what the president says. You realize that I'm investing in something for 30 years, and the odds are we're going to see some losses. And so you see those sort of changes are going to happen anyway. You're seeing it happen on the ground. Again, I mentioned in the book the change in Florida orange groves under cultivation. Why it's down something like close to 50% in terms of citrus crops. Why? Because you've had 10 major storms. And if you knock all my oranges or grapefruits off the tree, I can't recover from them. And around the world, something on the order of 40% of the world's food comes from smallhold farmers. Those are not people who have the capital, if you have a bad harvest or two, to sustain themselves. They're going to go out of business. So all of these things will create a sense of urgency and a sense of crisis. Now, coming up the next 5 years, we're going to start the negotiations for what happens after Paris, right? So 2030. The current administration will be up in 2028. So it's only within 3 years. So a lot of things are happening. We're also having huge changes in data. Al Gore's Trace, right, is a fantastic set of tools because it takes away all the self-reporting. In the first 5 to 10 years of what we were doing for nationally determined contributions and things, a lot of what countries and companies did is you submitted your data, and a lot of it was exaggerated. So it's a perfect example of greenwashing that countries all over the world did. Now we're taking that away from people. We're saying, no, we're relying on satellite data because the FAO in Rome says we have more forest cover, but the satellite says we have less. Who am I going to believe? I'm going to believe the satellite cover. So there are things like that. There's also some big changes in artificial intelligence, which will clearly happen. But to me, the next big thing, I'm sorry, is the last thing. It's still going to be biodiversity and climate change because we are not meeting the goals, which means we are getting warmer and weather patterns are changing and more extreme weather will happen and sea levels are rising. And so all of this, regardless of your political opinion, if you ignore it, it doesn't change the facts. So this will keep coming back. Now, those other tools and things will become useful, but it is going to say, as problems get more important, the skill set that senior leaders really need is that collaborative skill set. You need to be able to negotiate. You need to be able to work with teams. You need to be able to work with your suppliers and suppliers of suppliers where you don't have direct authority. So you've got to be able to find ways to build coalitions, to work with your ecosystem and things. So that collaborative leadership skill set, I think, becomes more and more important. I think it is not necessary that you become an expert on all the reporting jargon. I doubt anyone at BASF who's at a senior level understands all the waste treatment issues that go on in all factories. It's not a realistic expectation. even though it's very important, but that's not it. So I think the issues will be the same. The goals will have to get tougher. If the goals don't get tougher, again, nothing changes. We're just going to slide towards it. But that to me is when you come back to the ethical, sustainable leader, you have to be able, some people have to be able to say, do I want to leave the planet a better place for my children and my grandchildren? Simple as that. I mean, you really get down. Do I want to, doesn't matter what you want to make. Do I want to make a nice car? Do I want to make profit? Yes, but you have to solve a problem. And just saying, oh, no, we're eliminating all the regulations. You can make as many diesel cars as you want. I don't think that actually helps Ford or GM or Toyota.
You mentioned a moment ago the EU leadership in this area, which I think we all observe and acknowledge. Where would you? But at the same time, of course, I've heard endless complaints about CSRD and even CBAM.
Yep.
Where would you want to be if you were, say, embarking on a career as a business leader or as an emerging leader with a sustainability orientation? Where would you want to be working today?
Oh, I think Europe is still relevant. I think the key issue is find a challenge you can really get your hands around where you think you can make a difference. And again, if you're interested in the outdoors, if you're interested in, there's wonderful agricultural opportunities all over the place. And despite the fact of cutbacks in public policy, if you really believe in that and want to go work at an NGO and things, there are lots of problems to solve. So I would never discourage anyone from going to work. I mean, I worked at the UN for quite a few years, and I'd be the first one to say it's very bureaucratic and can be very inefficient, but it is an absolutely necessary organization. And so should it be reformed? Yeah, sure, absolutely. But if that's where your passion is, go for it. There's wonderful foundations out there that never existed when I started my career that people can get engaged in. There's writing. I mean, there's a lot of sustainability things that could be done in early childhood education, in literature, all over the place. Little kids get it. You don't have to tell a little kid not to throw plastic because the fish will eat it or the poor turtles will die. They get it. Don't hurt the turtle. These things are natural. And so we could create a generation that is much more attuned to not harming the communities where we live and work and the air we breathe and the water and things like that. There's huge innovation out there on plastics. Just because if you're a chemist, it's not my thing, but if that's what gets you excited, wow, there's all sorts of things that you could do in that area. So I think you find your passion, you do it. And if it's music, great. But you still have to think in this mindset of we're trying to create a better planet. And how does my effort help with that? And you'd be surprised when you get the right thinking, there's lots of opportunity for people. And again, I think the basic lessons remain. And everybody gets 4 votes, right? So you get a vote as a citizen, right? On who you vote for. You get a vote on the job that you work at. And so where do you want to work? And if it's a tough environment versus an easy environment, choices are different, but nevertheless, you get a choice of how you want to live your career. You get a vote as a consumer, right? Is this shirt made of cotton or does it come from fossil fuels? You should at least know the answer to those sort of questions. And you get in vote with your investments. Even if you don't have a lot of money, you can still ask the question, is my bank or my insurance company or my investment company, or even if I'm investing in Bitcoin or something, is that a sustainable product? And I should at least be able to answer that question. And I think if everybody took those votes seriously, I think we'd be in better shape. And then they can move to the next step, which is on a concrete basis. How do I evolve my business in the right direction? How do I lead from a low level, from a mid level, from a senior level? And I think there's great opportunity everywhere.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great point to end on. And I look forward to seeing the next generation of leaders reading your book and hopefully acting on it as well. There's a lot of great material in it at the end, by the way. The 66 list of 66, what was it?
Terms.
Ideas or, so yeah, 66 terms worth knowing, and a lot of which I have to confess I did not know myself before I read them. And especially the reflection exercises, I think, are fantastic. I mean, it really it makes you think twice and three times. You know, topics like biomass and regenerative forestry and afforestation credits, things that when you really do a bit of a deep dive on there, it's never as simple as you think, of course. So let's see. I hope that more people will read this book and take it seriously. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me, and I look forward to seeing more from this area.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. And again, again, the book is designed as much as possible as something where you can take action. And I think that's the intent. You show people should be able to read it, take it, and go do something as a result of that. And if they do, then I've done my job well. Thank you.
Thanks. A reminder, Leading the Sustainable Organization by Peter McAteer. Thanks so much.
Okay. Take care.